using resources that are not in the textbook, specifically books written like The Corporation of the Indian, The Road to Disappearance by Angie DeBow, The History of the Indians, as well as In Still the Waters Run. We can gain some insight into things that are not necessarily in the textbooks. Now, as citing direct sources, if you read the treaty with the Cherokees in 1835 and the removal, in Article 6, it says the United States agrees to protect the Cherokee Nation from domestic strife and foreign enemies and against intestine wars between the several tribes. This becomes important because all of the tribes in removal are guaranteed the protection of the United States. But when the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas introduced a bill that divided the land west of Missouri into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. He argued for popular sovereignty. Let me see here. But the Missouri Compromise of 1820 would allow slavery to be outlawed in both territories. If you rock it up to 1860, Horace Greeley, who owned the Tribune, the New York Tribune, said, "Otherwise his extermination is inexorably certain," in his article on Lo, the Poor Indians. What he's starting to advocate is something in the United States that was being talked about. He was advocating that if the Indian would not civilize, he should be exterminated. This is very Machiavellian. As a matter of fact, it's horrible. It's saying an entire people should be killed if they don't become like the rest of America. As a result, in 1860, and William Seward, being from New York as well, says the Indian Territory, also south of Kansas, must be vacated by the Indians. So here you see the William Seward, who's speaking on behalf of the future President Lincoln, is openly advocating the removal of Indians, again, a second removal. This would have been very, very upsetting to tribal leaders. Now, in one textbook that you'll see, it admits that only 1% of the people were large slaveholders among the Indians, among the 5 tribes. So that means 99% of the individuals in the tribe did not own slaves. That means among the Cherokee, only 170 owned slaves, Choctaw and Chickasaw 290, Seminole 20, and Creeks 143. So slavery was owned by the rich among the 5 tribes. Most of the tribal members didn't like it and didn't want it, and they couldn't have afforded it even if they did want it. That's important to remember because the textbooks make it look like the 5 tribes were major slaveholders. It's true that a lot of the mixed bloods owned a lot of slaves, and especially those that were educated out in the States. And so by 1860, you're going to see 1861, you're going to begin to see all these treaties with confederacies by leaders of the 5 tribes, as well as the Comanche, the Osage, Senecas and Shawnees, and finally the Cherokee. Now, that doesn't make sense when you see those signatures in July and October. But if you read the Commissioner's Report in 1861, he says, and the further fact that almost immediately after breaking out of hostilities between the government and its disloyal citizens, the forts in their vicinity were in many instances basely surrendered and to the rebels by officers in command, and so far as possible all United States troops withdrawn by the government from that section of the country. It's not surprising that many of the Indians have thrown off their allegiance and espoused the cause of the rebellion, and that many others, finding themselves entirely without support from the government or the means to repel the violent and aggressive measure everywhere adopted by the rebels towards loyal citizens, have quietly submitted to the condition of affairs by which they were surrounded. Translation. The first thing the United States does upon the Civil War is they pull all of the Union soldiers out of Fort Gibson and all those other forts that were placed there by treaty to provide protection for the tribes. And so by 1861, the Southern Superintendency of the government mentions that 3,200 of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw have gone over to the rebel side. But 3,350 Creeks or Muskogee remain within the Union and joined the Union cause. So more Indians already at the outset of the Civil War were joining the Union than were joining the Confederacy. So this myth that the tribes were disloyal and therefore deserved to lose the land that would become Oklahoma that's just it's just a drastic misstatement. The Homestead Act is passed in 1862, which allows people to take 160 acres if they farm it. Okay, this is going to have portent for the tribes in the future. The Battle of Honey Springs in 1863 is fought. What is interesting is that the Union wins, even though it is overrun. Two important divisions fight: the Indian Home Guard and like the Cherokee Mounted Rifles, as well as the other Choctaw and Chickasaw Confederates. Now, number one, if you look at the Choctaw flag, you'll notice it's only got two arrows. Only two districts, two bands of the Choctaw joined. The third remained neutral. This is important. I just want to bring that up. Not all the Choctaws joined the Confederacy. But at the Battle of Honey Springs, it's also very important because much credit by General Blunt is given to the 1st Kansas Colored. They fought like veterans and preserved their line unbroken throughout the engagement. Their coolness and braveness I have never seen surpassed. It says they were in the hottest of the fight and opposed to the Texas troops twice their numbers. So that's a distinction that the Kansas Colored unit deserves at the Battle of Honey Springs. Now, that same year in the superintendency, he admits, "I'm fully of the opinion that if the government, at the breaking out of the rebellion, had promptly afforded the various tribes of Indians in Indian Territory the protection provided for in existing treaty stipulations, and expel from the soil of the latter of those persons who were held at the same time the positions of superintendent agents under the United States government, and who were continued as such by the rebels, and who, together with a lot of thieves and vagabonds for many years hung around these Indians, they would have all remained loyal, and gratuitously have furnished the federal government every able-bodied man that they could spare for the purpose of suppressing in and driving out from their country all traitors." So the Southern Superintendency is saying, look, this is our problem. We pulled our troops out, and we provided no protection that was required under the treaties. So in the same report, he says, although the alternate occupation of the country by the rebels as well as Union forces, depredations have been committed of every description. The horses have been stolen. Vast herds of their cattle have been in most wasteful and extravagant manner used for subsistence. Besides, many were driven away into Kansas and sold. Their buildings and fences have been destroyed, and the country generally devastated and pillaged. I want you to note that he's saying this was done by Confederates and Union soldiers against the tribes. He says, he goes on to say, from being the once proud, intelligent, wealthy tribe of Indians, the Cherokee are now stripped of nearly all. They have lost so much in numbers. He says the Cherokee Indians have not received the protection stipulated in the treaty with them. In the Southern Superintendency, he goes on in 1864 to discuss the 15,000 destitute Indians that were among them, which means that on page 38, he says there's initially 2,200 that fought for the Union. Now, if you remember, 1,400 Cherokee fought for the Confederacy. That means twice as many Cherokee were fighting for the Union than they were fighting for the Confederacy. He also says when he arrived in the city, he found 300 Choctaws in the federal lines. And he says, I have been informed by Jeremiah Ward and other influential Choctaws that prior to the defeat of our forces under General Banks and Steele under Red River, the first rebel Choctaw regiment under General Cooper, former United States, had refused to fight any longer, and that the same feeling was generally among the full-bloods of the nation. In other words, the tribes were like, no, we don't like this. So I want you to see that the tribes' involvement in the Civil War was because they were forced to be involved. So in sum up, he mentions that there are, he eventually says that there's 3,000 that fought for the United States, and only 1,375 of the Creeks fought for the Confederacy. Again, double the amount of Muskogees fought for the Union than fought for the Confederacy. Sand Creek Massacre happens in 1864. John Shivington goes in and kills as many as 230 men, women, and children. that belonged to the Cheyenne and Arapaho. This is an important moment in history because this is going to start seeing. You're going to start seeing what's going to propel the Western Wars. In 1865, he proposes that a majority of the Seminole tribe joined the Creeks, the loyal Creeks in Kansas. This is of the 2,500 tribal members, only 500 remained in the Confederacy. So, like 3-1 of the Seminoles fought for the United States and remained loyal to the Union. The Quapaw, the 670 that were moved to Kansas, that were among the Ottawa, showed no sympathy to the rebellion. The Ogata. So Commissioner Cooley says that's when he disputes that the total destruction of Indians. He says that it would cost 300,000 lives to destroy those people. I just want you to see that the United States was on the verge of becoming what we would see happen in Nazi Germany, and that is Indians essentially exterminated. The surrender treaties were signed, which we agreed to allow in railroads. The 5 tribes did, and as a result, one of the things that's just completely missing from all the textbooks is that the person that wrote the surrender document at Appomattox was Colonel Parker of the Seneca. He was a full-blood Seneca chief, and he was also a descendant of Chief Red Jacket of the Seneca. Now, another thing that those textbooks show is you'll see Confederate Indian pictures about 6 times. You only see one Union Indian picture, when the fact is clearly a majority of the Indians fought for the Union. One of the most famous heroes of the Creeks is Chitto-Harjo, who fought for Abitli Yehola and was a Union soldier. So as a result of this, whenever the statehood comes through and they list him as the Chitto-Harjo Rebellion, you've got to remember he was a Union veteran opposed to the United States taking the land from the Indians again. He had served the country. So that makes it more of a legitimate claim, not like he was just out being a wild Indian. 300,000 cattle are stolen during the Civil War. $2 million worth from the Cherokee alone. So as a result, 9,000 Cherokee were having to apply for rations from the United States. It says that the military force to protect the Indians, were the culprits. He mentions that it's prominent Indian agents in Kansas. So the Union is literally ripping off the tribes from their cattle. Eventually, as a result, the western half of Oklahoma has to be sold to make reparations. The Cherokees lose half, Choctaws lose half, the Creeks lose half. Now, it makes sense that the Choctaws would have to lose half because a majority of them remain loyal. But if you look at their proximity to Texas and Arkansas, it's like they really didn't have much of a choice between a rock and a hard place. But the Cherokee and the Creeks had to lose half their land as well, which does not make any sense considering that a majority of those tribes had served the Union. So by 1866, 1 billion acres are lost in the United States to tribes. Interesting fact is that General Pike of the Confederacy, who executed the treaties among the tribes, was a noted Freemason. He was a sovereign grand commander in Washington, D.C. after the Civil War. He also is probably linked to the foundation of the KKK.